Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time to join the Data Legends podcast today, Stories from the IT Trenches, where we focus on bringing together IT leaders of all different types to share their perspective on what works, what doesn't work, how do you build and lead a team in today's very diverse and constantly changing work environment. And today's guest is Robert Cooke, the CTO and founder of ThreeForge. Robert, we are really happy to have you here today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Courtney.
Of course, of course. So I know we're going to cover a series of topics today. First, it would probably be great for the audience to just get a little bit of sense for your background and experience and what you're doing today in your present role.
Okay, yeah, sure, happy to do that. So first off, Robert Cooke. I have been uh, self-proclaimed programmer my whole life. Ever since I was a little kid, I was fascinated by computers. They seemed like these magical things. When I was 8 years old, real young, I started getting into this stuff. And obviously, at some point, you realize it's very math-based, and then I started paying a lot more attention to the discipline of computer science and thinking along those lines. And then after that, went to Rensselaer Polytechnic. Following that, I started at Bear Stearns, where I kind of got my first opportunity to really build and work on systems. I was on the regulatory reporting side. I also did high frequency trading, built high frequency trading systems, which is an interesting class of problem in and of itself. Following that, I was the head of infrastructure at the Dark Pool LiquidNet. And then in 2010, I started ThreeForge, which has been a very exciting adventure for the last 12 years. And, it's all led up to this podcast, to this very moment now.
Well, that's good. I like to see that the culminating moment is the Data
It's all
Legends
coming together.
podcast. No,
Yes.
certainly a lot of diverse experience. It's amazing how even as a child, people choose a thing. And I hear you mention that you liked computer programming, and now that's become both a passion and a career. And it's nice to see those two things coming together.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about no shortage of expertise, both in financial services, tech companies, consultative roles. There's all sorts of perspective. I'm sure you draw from, Robert. But let's talk about some of the macro trends that you're seeing. So, what are the sorts of trends that you're seeing when it comes to data and analytics today that are really exciting to you, and why? And if you want to talk
Hmm.
about some that aren't as exciting to you and why that is, feel free.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll start off with the exciting stuff, and then maybe I'll dovetail into the less exciting stuff. But um, so I think when it comes to the trends, well, I guess as a bit of a backdrop, when I kind of look back in, let's call it 2000, when I started out, I think people were very excited about technology because basically it allowed us to, it goes without saying, automate things that were being manually done and doing it in a computerized way or an automated way. And so basically there was just this waltz we did where you just took every single system and every single thing that was being manually done and you find a way to make it automated. And that was great, and it made things way more efficient in systems, and companies much more responsive and profitable and all those great things. But along the way, you end up with these siloed solutions because just kind of like how we managed systems like we manage people. You take it, you give them a manager, you have them, you go build a particular solution, and then that kind of works in a silo, and then you rinse and repeat. And now what we've ended up with is a lot of siloed solutions. So you're asking, what do I see the trend as? I see the trend as now, in order to get that next level of competitive edge, it's about taking those siloed solutions and building a unified solution on top of it, or at least from the end user's perspective, providing a unified solution. Now, my background is in finance, so the analogy I would use is asset classes. So you have things like fixed income, foreign exchange, equities, et cetera, et cetera. Those were generally built and thought of as individual sort of problems to be solved. But the problem is, at the end of the day, the customers, they are trading and they are executing instruments in all of these different asset classes, and they basically want a solution that cuts across that. So that's, I think, one of the big trends that's hitting right now. And again, I'm choosing finance because I'm in finance, but I think what we're seeing, whether it be restaurants and your Google Maps, or what, take whatever problem you want. People want unified solutions that cut across all these sort of siloed things. I think that's one huge trend. Another trend that's been very interesting for 3Forge is the explosion of opportunity and demand in the APAC, in the Asian markets. So I think, 20 years ago, almost all of development, all of this work was being done out of the US. Most customers were US. If you just looked at exchange volumes as an indicator, just the amount of being traded, it was mostly done out of the US. Over time, you've seen more in Europe, and now we're seeing a truly global effort. And so actually for 3Forge, we've opened an office in Singapore last year. We opened an office in London 2 years ago. But for us, the big trend that we're seeing is that people, I suppose you could draw an analogy. It's a unified solution now geographically as well. So people don't want to think of, I operate in North America, I operate in Europe, I operate in Asia. It's I operate on, well, I guess Earth. And then I want to basically, have someone being monitoring and watching my systems, or as we call it, follow the sun sort of technology. So I think those are two interesting trends that we see in full effect right now.
Yeah, the breaking down of the silos piece, you can see that really persists even in a data environment, right? So like, what do we say at Chaos Search? What do we see it often? We see organizations that want to ask questions of all of these different types. So this need to say, hey, how do I get a single representation of all that data without having to work on it here and work on it there? It is nirvana for a lot of customers and users because the pain has become so extreme. But it's hard to really get there. So no, it's interesting that you're also seeing that. And this follow the sun mentality that you offered is also seems to be pretty persistent, right? You've got organizations that are not just US based, right? You have so much activity globally that today's organizations must be thinking about things from a worldview, even in this post-COVID world where travel is not, as persistent yet, but it doesn't change the fact that the same things that are happening in your space are happening globally. So
Right.
yeah, no, definitely interesting. It'll be interesting to see how you talked about opening a couple offices, both in Asia and Europe, how that's driving your business. But why don't we we're going to go into tactics for a couple minutes. And I know this is something that you've certainly given a lot of thought to, but as we think about companies today dealing with all the things we just talked about, data volumes growing explosively, distributed teams, globally distributed teams, and this need for kind of really driving productivity while also keeping, talent both engaged and excited. But how do you see firms really being able to address this IT budget increase, and what can be done to really bend the curve?
hmm Yeah, I mean, when it comes to, I think we call it technical debt, which is the idea that you built these systems, and then over time these systems need to be maintained, and then you end up building systems on top of them. I'm going to go back to that story of 20 years ago when we were just happy to get these solutions in place because everything we did was an improvement. I mean, you're taking a manual process and automating it, so that's great. But the problem is along the way. I think people were very, very drastic or looking to get these solutions done quickly, and we were able to build things very fast because we had everything was greenfield, don't have a lot of legacy. But then and I think from a P&L perspective, or from a perspective from what your costs are versus the benefits, it was just, hey, pour some money into IT. It's not that much compared to all our other costs, and so let's just keep doing that, and things will get better. But what's interesting, and I think we all would agree now, that while the costs of IT maybe 25 years ago was pretty small on the balance sheet, now it's an overwhelming a factor. I mean, it is one of the largest percentages, and you can only assume that if this trend continues, at some point your costs will be nearly 100% will be IT. I mean, maybe right now, I think when I ask our customers, they're seeing something around 40 to 60% of their cost is in that range, which is already becoming pretty dramatic. So how can we cut that? Well, I think in an ideal world, if we were to be perfectly efficient, I think it should be a very small percentage of the current spend spend needs to be spent. But I think what needs to happen is we need to think a lot more um, in a much more data agnostic mentality, because going back to my experience, when I was at Bear Stearns, I was doing regulatory reporting. I was also doing, like I said, high frequency trading. I was working on something called transaction cost analysis, which gets a little bit more into the data mining side of things. And then when I was at infrastructure, I was doing at LiquidNet, I was doing more of managing the IT and stuff along those lines. And what I noticed is that at every one of these opportunities, or at every one of these responsibilities, the technology platforms seem to be quite different. Sometimes they'd be using Python, sometimes we'd be using Perl. Maybe this will use SQL, maybe no SQL over here. And while sometimes that makes sense, I think when you actually look at the problem set, there's way more overlap than there is differences and disparities between these. And so I think in order to really cut these costs, I think it's about looking for the commonalities in these problems and trying to find platforms and solutions that can be used, that can be leveraged across a series of problems, as opposed to getting bespoke solutions that just solve one little problem. And I think that and that has a multitude of effects. One, and I think you could take Java as an example. Java is actually, and most of these languages, but I think I especially like to call on Java because it's a fairly broad and generic language that lets you do many different things. And so if you look at something like that, and you start to use that in a variety of use cases, then you can build up expertise in that language. You can start to build libraries and tools that can be used across that, et cetera, et cetera. So really at 3Forge, our thought process has been to take that to the next level, to really look for the best in breed ways of solving these different problems, put that collection together, and then offer that as a platform. But putting 3Forge aside, I think that is really how you cut costs, is by thinking about your problems as really opportunities to utilize building blocks and reuse those building blocks as much as possible.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. What do you think then? And it goes kind of into our next question. As you start to think about efficiencies, right? And which of your legacy offerings can really be legacy? How do you really think that companies get there, right? Because you're talking about consolidation and optimization, and a lot of processes there maybe are being run independently, but not because they have to be running on all these different systems. Mm-hmm. How do organizations really think about reducing spend by not maintaining a lot of this legacy stuff? How do you make the right choice?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think, I mean, first off, you can look at it from a dollars and cents perspective, where you're spending most of your money, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the tragedies is, though, a lot of times people go to replace systems, and then if there isn't a really thought out, well understood approach to that, you actually end up with two systems, which is almost worse. You know what I mean? You go to replace system A,
right.
and we're going to update it with new technology, and then you end up with two systems instead. So that's not much better. What I favor is to actually follow a concept of, leave the data where it is, leave the systems where they are, think of them as building blocks, try to almost shrink wrap it as much as you can. As much as I don't like to use that term, you basically are going to just shrink wrap it, put a layer over it, think of it as an asset, and then basically build on top of that. And then, of course, there's cases where, yes, that doesn't work. The system, maybe for compliance reasons, or maybe it's just too slow, or has too many performance issues, or maybe its capabilities are just suffering so much that you have to replace that. But this is where I think a whole series of tools come into play here around recon. And I think reconciliation is in a not a very well understood art. And it's extremely important when you're migrating from system, when you're deciding to replace a system, because inevitably, whether you like it or not, at some point there's going to be the old system running, and there's going to be the new system running, and then there's going to be a migration that's taking place. And during that migration, and slightly before and slightly after, you want to have good reconciliation tools to look between them. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the data probably should look pretty similar as an output between the two. And so you can build a lot of tools around that. So I think just kind of like when you build a building, in New York City, in fact, they're tearing down and rebuilding a building next door to us right now. What's the first thing you do? Well, actually, not to get into the details, you take lots of measurements of the city around you to make sure you're not disturbing the surroundings. You put up scaffolding. I mean, you put a lot of prep work into it before you even tear down that first brick or put up that first I-beam. You put a lot of work into preparing, setting up that infrastructure and that scaffolding, and then basically you can do your work. And I think one of the issues with trying to just replace systems head on is not thinking about that surrounding work that needs to be done. It is an interesting challenge, though. It's one I've been through many times, trying to, taking old systems and replacing them with new systems. So each time it's a little different, and obviously experience is important there.
Yeah, and maybe I guess we see it exacerbated as organizations at this moment are still trying to make that choice between on-prem or cloud, depending on the application and how much of their infrastructure to really minimize, and can they go all in on a cloud environment, and where does that make sense? And uh, we're going to talk about specifically for IT, IT and financial services institutions. How do you really design solutions that are resonant and scalable? And I'm sure you see that there, where sort of data privacy and sensitivity of information, but also performance of certain data sets are essential.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit about how you've worked to really create IT solutions for large companies and financial institutions that align with where the market's going.
Yeah, the cloud versus not cloud just debate is an interesting one. I mean, I talked to some leaders at some of the largest global financial institutions that swear up and down that everything is going to go into the cloud, everything. And then there's others that think it's actually going to be mitigated, and most things are going to be done internally, and because of security risks and all of these regulations coming out of Europe. So it's interesting to see how this plays out. If I were a gambling man, which I'm not. Um, but if I were a gambling man, I would say that I think, yes, we're going to end up in a hybrid situation. I believe that what's going to happen, and again, I'm going to speak mostly from my background, which is finance, but I think it will be the same in IoT and a lot of other fields, which is that certain problems scale very well. And the problems that can scale very well, and I mean, when I say scale, I mean elastically scale. So an example would be storing data. That's something that can actually scale quite well. You've got a defined schema or not if you're using NoSQL, but you've got some sort of set of data that you want to index on, and it's easy to scale that across systems. That sort of stuff I think makes a lot of sense for the cloud. Certain intellectual property, especially when it's very time sensitive, that gets a little bit more complicated in order to get that into the cloud. And especially once you start to get into certain regulatory requirements, HIPAA and things like that, where people are a little bit more concerned about the sensitivity of that data and the reliability of that data. That stuff is still I could see being stored internally. But I think it does make sense to approach this from a hybrid solution. And again, I come back to recon. I think recon, once again, is a very important thing, because whether or not you decide to be in the cloud tomorrow, there you have lots and lots of systems. When I say you, I mean anyone who's been doing this for a while, definitely have lots of systems that aren't in the cloud now. And there has to be a path in order to, how do you get that data from your internal systems into the cloud? And once again, I come back to recon. Reconciliation is a very important part, because as you take all this data and all these systems that are running internally, and then you want to migrate them to the cloud, how do you know you're doing that correctly? How do you have peace of mind that you're getting this correct? Especially going back to finance, when you have transactional systems and you can't afford to lose any data, and you're basically obligated to store and have all this information. These recon tools are very important. Of course, anything can be done by hand and manually, but having efficient, reliable tools is a key part of that. And again, that's something that we focused a lot on.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense not to. The complexity of making a lot of those choices is certainly hard. Um, do you think that when you're thinking about financial institutions specifically today, do you guys have, I say you guys, like in your Three Forge experience, Do you think that organizations of certain sizes are more ripe for change than others, or are you seeing a lot of this transformation in organizations of a certain size within the financial services space, um, or is it just size agnostic?
Right. Well, it almost feels to me that it's almost more product driven than company size driven. Definitely different companies with different cultures have different appetites for how much they're willing to do this. And it's also, I would say, it's definitely different regions as well. So I think the United States, I mean, at least it seems as though domestically, we're seeing a lot more of stuff being pushed into the cloud. We'll see how this trends in other regions. But I think in terms of size of company, well, the larger the company, the bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn it. So there's certainly that, but it doesn't mean that they're not making those decisions to move into the cloud. It just takes a lot longer to course correct and things along those lines when you're handling a much larger project. Now, when I deal with small companies, in fact, we're pretty hybrid ourselves. We run a lot of 3forge.com and those sort of services we're running in the cloud. All of our lab and everything for doing high performance testing, that's actually still running in our internal lab on site. So we're an example of someone who's hybrid. Now, I think when you get into the smaller company, let's say the few hundred employees or less, or that sort of situation where they've only been around for maybe 10 years, it's much easier for them to be in the cloud. And from my perspective, it seems as though most of them are cloud based at this point, at least most of our customers in that space.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of that at Chaos Search too. I mean, obviously, we have a solution that is built to activate organizations who are already in S3 or other cloud platforms for
Mm-hmm.
storage. But the number of organizations, even compared to 3 to 4 years ago, that have really moved to this all-in cloud-first strategy appear, it's pretty voluminous and
Mm-hmm.
horizontal in terms of industry. Certainly is
Yeah.
what we've
Well,
seen.
I mean, there's some companies that we work. Yeah, there's some company customers of ours that 5 years ago, if you'd asked them, they would have said no way. And then now you're seeing at least a percentage of their capacities being done inside the cloud. Yeah.
And then let's maybe take this to just something a little bit more tactical from a perspective sharing, which is whether it's your team at Three Forge or organizations that you offer guidance to and develop solutions for. When you see some of these technologies come into market, so we talked about at the top of the call, thinking about this breaking down the silos and this trend to really deliver a more unified experience for customers and IT organizations to operate in. When you see technologies that help address those sorts of challenges, how do you really think about what you recommend, red flags that you want to make sure you're kind of leery of,
Hmm.
and then what's your process for saying, hey, this is really worth considering, or conversely, this is something we want to stay away from,
Hmm.
whether it's in your company or in your client scenarios, because there's just, I say it, I'm a marketer. I'm inundated with messages every day, and I send messages every day. Everybody's sort of trying to solve the same challenge. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not amazing technology coming to market that is fundamentally disruptive, but sometimes it's hard to tune out the noise and really find the nuggets that are useful. So,
Yeah,
how do you
yeah.
do that?
So, I mean, from my perspective, I come back to that data agnostic concept at the top of the call, which is, what I would look for in solutions to help kind of cut across and provide the sort of horizontal solutions people are looking for now. I would say data agnostic building blocks is the way to go. I think there's actually a lot that goes into what you need in order to have these building blocks. I mean, some examples are you need to have the ability to coerce and adapt to lots of different types of data. You have to have entitlements around that. You have to, you have to be flexible in terms of being able to have plugins and all of those sorts of things. You have to be able to expand and be elastic. You can't be confined to one machine. So there's a whole laundry list of things to go into that I think are important. I think some red flags are, for me, if I were solving this, if I were my customers, it is really what, is the solution purpose built to solve one small thing? That's what I always get worried about, because I've seen, the lists of the number of vendors that it can take to, if you decide to build these small purpose built solutions, hundreds of vendors each doing one tiny little thing. And then naturally, as you have all of these different vendors each solving one tiny little problem, you end up with all of these sort of disjointed systems, which is kind of setting you further back, right? So for me, I think that the days of I would hope that the days of being a vendor that just says, I'm going to have this screen that solves this sort of problem, are over with, and it's more like, we have a solution and this is our approach. And again, it's a little bit more founded in just the basic concepts of computer science, of how do we deal with data and things along those lines, as opposed to, yeah, maybe I'll flip it around. I think solutions that are more founded in thinking about the fabric of a system and working up, as opposed to basically saying, I'm going to solve this tiny little problem, get myself in there, and then try to just maintain that stickiness on that one little piece.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it hard to, in today's environment, make room for a whole bunch of technology
Mm-hmm.
that can only solve for a thing or two things. That extensibility to really be flexible in terms of the different types of
Yeah.
asks an organization
And
has, or just, and as you noted, like a foundational structure that allows you to be more versatile in nature
I think, going back,
versus.
before, you're asking about how can you cut costs. Well, I think one of the biggest costs, one of the biggest unsung costs of technology, is all of the glue code and all of the kind of hacky code that is necessary to get all of these different systems, whether they're built internally or purchased through vendors. Basically, all this code just to try to get data from system A over to system B, map this to that. Oh, this speaks that. And not only is it very expensive to maintain, it's not exactly a glamorous job either. And on top of that, it's also very problematic. And so the more you can eliminate kind of all of these glue code sort of hacks and workarounds, I think the better you are in saving money as well. So I guess, almost subconsciously, that's another reason I think it's important to think about these interoperable building blocks.
Yeah, no, and the term building blocks, like it never really, it doesn't get old, because I think everybody really understands that at the end of the day, when you think about what I think about it in my own marketing organization, right? Do we have the essential technology in place that's going to allow us to do what we need to do today and 365 days from now?
Mm-hmm.
And that can't be in a small team or even a medium-sized team running 20 different martech products. It just can't,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you've got to figure out what are the types of solutions that do work together, but also allow you the greatest efficiency across the team as you scale. So,
Yeah.
really, really helpful perspective. I think, we started the talk with IT budgets continue to go up and up because as a proportion of spend, there's just so much lean on technology, but have really spent some time thinking about how do you drive efficiency in that model and how you've seen efficiency being driven. And I have to imagine, for those that tune into this podcast on a regular basis, that is a top concern, which is, it's not that organizations aren't open to innovation. They absolutely are. But you got to be open to innovation that comes at, like any trade-off. If I bring this in, what am I taking out?
Mm-hmm.
So that you don't end up with a map of technology that ends up creating a whole lot more work than it's ever designed to
Yeah.
have solves for. So
Yeah, I think vendor consolidation is a big part of it. Trying to just reduce the number of vendors and the number of different products you're interfacing with. And again, by doing that, by streamlining that, you also can build up um, internal expertise on the vendors that you've decided to go with, and then that'll help you cut across that. So I think there is a lot of room for. I mean, there's obviously tons of room to be more efficient within IT, but I think it actually comes down to instrumentation and tooling is a really important part of it. And I come back to things like data reconciliation, and I know, like, I sound like a broken record here, but the amount of time I've personally seen wasted because you have these two different systems, and they're they just don't want to put a little bit of time into what it means to basically look at the data between those two systems and see if it's linking together. To me, it seems like a no-brainer that you'd have that. And in fact, for me, as an example, um, most of my customers, most of our customers, they will have an entire infrastructure, and then they will have that entire infrastructure again, so that they can have failover or backup for that one rainy day scenario that happens very infrequently. Yet they won't they're not spending the extra 2 or 3% to basically have all these checks and build a stack alongside that does this recon and helps them look at the tools. And again, I think if we look at the cost in technology, I think one of the most expensive, the most expensive item on that balance sheet is the developers, is the employees. I mean, when you look, yeah, computers are expensive or whatever, and you spend some money in the cloud, and yes, you've got your vendor costs and this and that and insurances, but it ultimately is the employees. That's what costs the money. And so if you can make your employees 50% more efficient through better tooling and better instrumentation, that's obviously worth it. That to me is a no-brainer. And so I think, to me, the tragedy is when you see these high-paid developers without the right sort of tools and the right ways to communicate with each other and communicate with their systems.
Yeah, it just is. It does not support efficiency in a scenario like that. And like you described, everybody, I mean, you see it in a team, trying to help the entire organization be 15%, 20% more efficient can have a really dramatic impact on outcomes. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, I really appreciate your perspective, Robert, and you taking the time to join us today. I know certainly our listening and viewing community are going to find your insights helpful. And if organizations want to learn a little bit more about 3Forge, it's number 3forge.com,
Mm-hmm.
I believe. And we really appreciate you taking the time
Yeah.
today. So with that, I will say yet another episode of Data Legends comes to a closure, and some great insight relative to where IT teams are spending money today, how we can do that better, and opportunities for efficiency across the board exist, and it's a matter of really trying to find them. So, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and everybody have a good afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
You too.